Picture a city built to defy the sea, now losing its balance in slow motion. Turquoise water surges through marble avenues. Gigantic columns tilt like falling metronomes, and beneath the surface, the last lights bloom in an eerie blue glow, as if the ocean itself is remembering. Atlantis is the most famous lost city on Earth, yet the very source that made it legendary also keeps it slippery. In real history, our clearest ancient account comes through Plato's dialogues, where Atlantis appears as a moral and political warning as much as a place. He describes a powerful maritime civilization and a sudden destruction in a single catastrophic interval, a one-day and night ending that feels final. But tonight we're going to ask a different question, one that turns a total collapse into a chain reaction. What if the city still sinks? The palaces still vanish, and the coastline still breaks. Yet the most important part of Atlantis isn't there when the wave arrives. Because if the fleet is at sea when the catastrophe hits, Atlantis doesn't die as stone and statues, it survives as ships, people and knowledge. And when a lost city becomes a moving network, the dominoes don't start with myth, they start with control of the sea. Now, before history bends, let's separate what we can say with confidence from what we can only imagine. Pause. In real history, Atlantis enters the record through Plato, chiefly in Timaeus and Critias, where the story is framed as a cautionary mirror for society, a wealthy seafaring power, grand rings of water and land, and a sudden catastrophe that erases it so completely that only memory remains. Plato even places it beyond the Pillars of Hercules, a phrase his audience would associate with the edge of the known world, which hints that the geography may serve the lesson as much as the atlas. That matters because it means Atlantis is not a confirmed archaeological site in the way Pompeii is. It is a narrative that later generations tried to pin to real maps. Over the centuries, people have proposed everything from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic as a candidate, but none has produced a consensus that ends the debate, and mainstream scholarship treats it as a literary construction with possible echoes of real events. And yet the world that could echo inside the myth was not imaginary. The late Bronze Age and early Iron Age Mediterranean was a web of coastal cities, islands, and sea routes where ships were the fastest way to move wealth, armies, and ideas. We also know that enormous natural disasters did strike that world. One of the most discussed examples is the massive eruption of Thera on what we call Santorini today, which likely sent tsunamis and ash across parts of the Aegean and may have pressured the Minoan world. That doesn't prove Atlantis, but it proves the kind of sudden regional shock Plato's audience could recognize as plausible. Now here's the hidden and most Atlantis conversations skip. In the Bronze Age, the ultimate power was not gold, and not even land. It was supply chains, especially tin. Pause. Bronze requires copper and tin was scarce, distant, and unevenly distributed, which meant that whoever controlled reliable maritime routes could quietly decide who got superior tools, stronger weapons, and faster ship parts. This is less known because the popular image of Atlantis is temples and crystals, not invoices and cargo lists. Yet logistics is exactly how real civilizations leap ahead. So when we talk about domino effects, we're not hunting a magical city, we're tracking what happens if a seafaring network survives a world-shaking event and suddenly becomes the gatekeeper of the Mediterranean's most fragile lifeline. And with that in mind, the next question becomes unavoidable. What happens when Atlantis loses its home but keeps its fleet? This is where history bends. Pause. In real history, Atlantis remains a philosophical story with uncertain geography and no verified survival timeline. But in this scenario, we change only one variable. When the catastrophe strikes, the Atlantean main fleet is not in harbor. It is already days away on a scheduled trade circuit, sails full, holds loaded, crews organized, and captains accountable to a system that expects them to return. This is a speculative alternate history scenario, and will keep the assumptions minimal. The fleet is large enough to matter. It carries portable wealth and skilled people, not just rowers, and it has a reason to regroup, rather than dissolve into piracy. Now imagine what the sailors see on their return. The familiar coastline is wrong. The sky has the bruised look of aftermath. The harbor mouth is choked with debris, and the landmarks they use for navigation have vanished, replaced by a new raw scar of water. They send a boat in, then another, and the silence answers them. The city that fed them, paid them, and gave their children a future is gone or uninhabitable. At that moment, Atlantis stops being a place and becomes a problem. They cannot simply go home, so they do what maritime people have always done when land fails them. They turn the sea into their continuity. First comes survival discipline. Pause. They ration, they record, they elect a council from captains and merchants, and they decide on a single rule that prevents collapse: the fleet stays together. Scribes who once tracked temple dues now track food, repairs and agreements. Shipwrights become as valuable as soldiers, and the fleet's memory routes, tides, port customs becomes a library that floats. Next comes the search for a shore that will accept them. They are refugees, yes, but refugees with ships, weapons, craftsmen, and something every coastal ruler fears: they lack predictable order. They approach a port and offer a deal that sounds generous and terrifying at the same time. We will protect your convoys, repair your docks, and reopen your trade routes. But we will also set standards, weights, and dues, because our survival requires a stable system. Some cities refuse and call them invaders. Others invite them in and call them saviors. And a few try to seize their ships outright, only to learn that a disciplined fleet can vanish beyond the horizon and return where you least expect. Now watch the hidden angle ignite. Pause. Because the fleet's true power is not its spears, it is its schedules. If they can guarantee tin arrives on time, bronze workshops keep running. If tin stalls, armies and tools degrade, and rulers lose legitimacy. So the fleet begins to do something subtle. It doesn't conquer with banners, it negotiates with bottlenecks, choosing which ports prosper by choosing which ports are connected. Within months they establish sister harbors, a chain of safe anchorages that share signals, storage and enforcement. Within years they become the most reliable moving institution in the region, an Atlantis that cannot be drowned, because it is no longer anchored to one vulnerable shoreline. And once that happens, the domino is set. Whoever needs metal, grain and safe passage will eventually have to speak Atlantean terms. So what happens next is less like a fairy tale, and more like economics with oars. That runs. In the short term, the surviving Atlantean fleet triggers a bidding war among coastal cities. Harbors that once taxed strangers now offer land, marriages and exemptions, because hosting the fleet means safer convoys and faster recovery after the regional shock. At the same time, piracy and raiding spike in the gaps where old powers falter, and the Atlanteans respond by doing what states do. They patrol, they punish, and they publish rules that make trade predictable again. In the midterm, predictability becomes an empire without a throne. The fleet standardizes weights and measures, sets port dues, and schedules escorted crossings, creating a league of trusted harbors that grows not by conquest, but by subscription. Workshops in member ports keep their bronze flowing because tin arrives more reliably. Rival ports face shortages that look like bad luck until it becomes clear it is policy. Grain moves the same way. Pause. When drought or ash-darkened seasons hit, the League can reroute food to allies first, turning hunger into leverage and turning gratitude into treaties. Local rulers begin to copy Atlantean record-keeping and contracts, because paperwork becomes the new weapon. The port that can promise delivery wins loyalty without drawing a sword. Conflicts still happen, but they change shape. Pause. Instead of sieges for land, you see embargoes, convoy wars, and sudden collapses when a city's bronze supply breaks and its army rusts into irrelevance. Even culture bends. A shared sailor's code and trade language spreads port to port, and Atlantean becomes less an ethnicity than a membership badge you earn by following the system. Now the long-term domino. Once a network controls the movement of metal, it also controls the movement of innovation. Navigation techniques spread inside the League, ship designs improve faster, and coastal diplomacy reorganizes around sea lane security. Instead of isolated city-states rising and falling randomly, you get blocks built around maritime insurance. Join the system and you prosper. Resist it and you pay more for every tool, every spearhead, every repaired keel. If you're hooked by this kind of logic-first alternate history, this is a perfect moment for a quick mid-roll, because the next beat is where one inland kingdom realizes too late that it can't fight a fleet by marching. And here's the domino tease. The most decisive battles of this era won't happen on beaches, but in ledgers that decide who gets to build the next century. Before we close, step back and notice what made this version of Atlantis powerful. It wasn't a secret crystal or a perfect map coordinate. It was the simple idea that a civilization can survive as a network even when its capital is erased. And it also keeps the story human. Families, skills and decisions carried across waves, not just ruins swallowed by silence. The Geopolitical one is this. Disasters don't just destroy buildings, they sever connections, and whoever can restore connections first often writes the next chapter. The Geopolitical 2, in a Bronze Age world, control of a scarce input like tin is not a trivia fact. It's the throttle on weapons, tools and shipbuilding, which means it's the throttle on politics. The Geopolitical 3, the most dramatic turning points can hide inside boring systems, schedules, contracts, escorted crossings, because logistics is how power becomes repeatable. And if that sounds almost too modern, that's the point. The past wasn't primitive, it was fragile, and fragility makes small changes explode into big outcomes. Now imagine the final ripple. The League born from a refugee fleet becomes so essential that inland kings must either join its rules or build a rival navy from scratch, and that tension is where the next great acceleration begins. Next episode, we'll push the timeline forward and ask what happens when this Atlantean League collides with a rising continental power. Do we get an empire centuries early, or a sea war that rewrites the entire Mediterranean map? If you want more logic-first, cinematic alternate history like this, subscribe to AI History Rewritten, because every episode starts with one believable divergence and follows the dominoes all the way down. And now I want to hear from you. If you were a ruler of a coastal city watching the Atlantean fleet arrive after the cataclysm, would you welcome them as partners, fear them as conquerors, or try to break their tin route, and why? Why?